July 19th, 2026, MetLife Stadium, New Jersey. 80,000 people inside, 1 billion watching at home. And in the middle of the most watched sporting event on Earth, 7 young men from South Korea walked out onto that stage. This is not just a K-pop story. This is the moment a genre, dismissed, mocked, and underestimated for a decade, finally stood at the very top of the world. And what it cost them to get there, you have no idea. If you rewind to 2013, BTS were 7 teenagers in a small practice room in Seoul, signed to a label so unknown that industry veterans didn't even bother writing them off. They just didn't write about them at all. Introduction. Who they were. They had no celebrity connections, no famous producer backing, no major label money. What they had was something harder to manufacture. Hunger. They wrote their own music. They made their own choreography. They told the truth about mental health, about loneliness, about being young and lost, at a time when K-pop didn't do that. K-pop was polished and perfect. BTS were human. And slowly, then all at once, the world noticed. Stadium tours, Grammy stages, UN speeches, presidential meetings. But even with all of that, even with a fandom of tens of millions called ARMY spread across every continent, there was one stage they had never stood on. The biggest stage in the history of human sports. Until now. Chapter 1. The Silence. But before we get to that stage, we need to talk about what they almost lost on the way there. Because what happened between 2022 and 2025 nearly ended BTS forever. Stay with me. June 2022. BTS were at the peak of their powers. Sold out stadiums, Billboard records, permission to dance was everywhere. And then, in a moment that sent shockwaves through the entertainment world, they announced a hiatus. Not a break, not a vacation. Jin enlisted first, December 2022. Then J-Hope, then the others, one by one, over 2 years. For ARMY, it felt like watching 7 lights go out, one by one. Concerts stopped. The group chat, for lack of a better word, went quiet. Other groups filled the space. Newcomers rose. Some people wondered, in the way you wonder about something you don't want to say out loud, whether BTS would come back to a world that had moved on. But here is what people were missing. Those 2.5 years didn't empty BTS. They filled them. Chapter 2. ARIRANG. Because when RM finally picked up a pen in that military barracks and started writing again, what came out would become one of the most important albums of the decade. And it all started with a folk song his grandmother used to sing. Coming up. March 20th, 2026. The album drops at midnight. 14 tracks. 1 title. ARIRANG. ARIRANG is one of the oldest folk songs in Korean history. A song of longing, of separation, of someone walking away over a hill and being watched by the people who love them. Koreans have been singing it for centuries. It has been sung during Japanese occupation. It has been sung across the DMZ. It is, in ways that are almost impossible to translate, the sound of Korea itself. That BTS chose it as the name of their comeback album wasn't just a creative decision. It was a statement. We came from here. We were always from here. And we are back. The album debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. It stayed there for 3 consecutive weeks. Their single Swim became the fastest song in history to reach 600 million Spotify streams. In its first week alone, the album moved 641,000 units in the United States, the largest single-week figure by any group since that chart began tracking units. But the numbers, as staggering as they are, miss the point. The point was the feeling. ARMY, who had waited 2.5 years, who had counted down days on handmade calendars, who had cried at discharge ceremonies they watched on phone screens from bedrooms in Jakarta and Sao Paulo and London and Lagos, finally heard their boys again. And the boys sounded like men who had something to say. The ARIRANG World Tour launched in April. 88 shows, 34 cities, 23 countries, $139 million in just the first 13 shows. But there was something even bigger coming, something that nobody had seen coming. And when it was announced, HYBE's stock jumped nearly $500 million in a single day. We'll get to that. Keep watching. Chapter 3. The Call. Here is something about the 2026 FIFA World Cup Final that most people don't know. The halftime show had never existed before. For 96 years, since the first World Cup in 1930, the final had no halftime performance. Football is different from American football. The pitch is sacred. The traditions are ironclad. You don't stop the game for entertainment until 2026. FIFA President Gianni Infantino had been quietly building toward this for 2 years. He wanted the World Cup Final, the most watched sporting event in human history, to mean something beyond football. He wanted a halftime show that would reach people who had never watched a match in their lives. He needed artists who were truly global, not just popular in America, not just famous in Europe. Artists who belonged to the entire world. The call went out. And among the names, alongside Madonna, who had conquered pop music across 5 decades, alongside Shakira, who had become synonymous with World Cup moments since 2010, was one more name. BTS. The announcement came on May 14th, 2026. A video. Chris Martin of Coldplay, the show's curator, alongside Sesame Street characters and the Muppets, because Chris Martin is exactly that kind of person, FaceTimed BTS in the video. 7 faces on a phone screen, laughing, saying they were in. Social media didn't just react, it detonated. HYBE's stock jumped 7.2% in a single trading session. That's over 700 billion Korean won, more than $470 million added to the company's market value in one day. Because investors understood what the music world was just beginning to absorb. K-pop had arrived. Not at a K-pop event, not at a music award show, at the World Cup. But here is what nobody was talking about. Behind that phone call, behind that announcement, there was a conversation between BTS and their team about what this moment would actually cost them. Emotionally, physically, logistically, on top of the most demanding world tour of their careers. And it almost didn't happen. Up next. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Moment. Let's talk about something that rarely gets discussed in the hype cycle around moments like this. BTS are not just musicians. They are, whether they signed up for it or not, symbols. To Korean culture, to the Korean wave, Hallyu, The phenomenon that has carried Korean music, film, food, and fashion to every corner of the planet over the past 2 decades. When they walk onto that World Cup stage, they are not just 7 artists doing a show. They are carrying the weight of an entire country's creative identity. That is an extraordinary thing to ask of any human being. And BTS have talked about it. In interviews, in lyrics, in live broadcasts to fans. RM, the group's leader and most verbally articulate member, once said he had thought tens of thousands of times about what happens to the members if the pressure becomes too much, about whether the group could survive its own mythology. The military hiatus, in some ways, was an answer to that question. A forced reset, a chance to be, briefly, just people, just men, not symbols. Quieter, more personal. Jin, during his military discharge interviews, laughed when he talked about performing without his members. Not in my wildest dreams, he said. He described the fan base, ARMY, as the reason he performs. It's the roar of the crowd that keeps me going. Jungkook told Rolling Stone he had built up a sense of longing during military service, that being unable to make music when he wanted to had made him want to do better, want to deliver something great. J-Hope told Apple Music that the time apart would give the group massive energy when they reunited. They were all right. ARIRANG is not the sound of artists coasting on their legacy. It is the sound of artists who had 2.5 years to remember why they started. Which brings us to July 19th, the day itself. What actually happened when BTS walked onto that pitch? And why one moment in that 11-minute performance is already being called one of the most watched clips in the history of live television? We're almost there. Chapter 5, July 19th. MetLife Stadium, East Rutherford, New Jersey. The first half of the World Cup Final ends. The scoreboard shows what it shows. And then, from somewhere beneath the stadium, the machinery of something unprecedented begins to move. The pitch, 105 meters of perfect grass, sacred for 90 years of World Cup history, is transformed. Stages built into the stadium stands rise. A lighting rig the size of a city block activates. And somewhere in the tunnel, 3 of the most famous musical acts on Earth breathe slowly, quietly, and wait. Shakira goes first. She performs Die Die, the official World Cup anthem, alongside the ghetto kids from Uganda, and the stadium becomes something that doesn't have a name in English. 1 billion people watching from their sofas in 80 countries lean slightly forward. Madonna follows. Decades of history compressed into 4 minutes. The crowd, 80,000 people who came here for football, chants along to things they didn't know they knew by heart. And then the stage shifts again. 7 spotlights, 7 positions, and then 7 men. The roar that comes out of MetLife Stadium in that moment is, by multiple accounts from people who were there, something they will spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. It is not the roar of a K-pop concert. It is not the roar of ARMY. It is the roar of 1 billion human beings from every nation on Earth, recognizing something at the same time. They open with Swim, the title track from ARIRANG, and the stadium sings it back. Not because everyone knows the Korean lyrics, because music doesn't work that way. Because you can feel a song before you understand it. They perform Dynamite, they perform Butter, and in the final minute, 11 minutes that felt like 11 seconds, they sing a verse of ARIRANG, the folk song, the one that is centuries old, the one that means longing and separation and coming home. At 80,000 decibels, inside the most watched sporting event in human history. Coldplay's Chris Martin, watching from the wings, later told a journalist it was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen at a live event. He had played Glastonbury. He had played the Super Bowl. He said he had never seen anything like this. Conclusion. What this moment actually means? There is a conversation that has been happening in music journalism and in cultural circles for about a decade now. When does K-pop stop being K-pop and just become pop? It is, honestly, the wrong question. BTS did not succeed at the World Cup by becoming less Korean. They succeeded because they were entirely, unapologetically, fully themselves. They sang in Korean on that stage. They performed a Korean folk song that is literally centuries old. They wore their history on their sleeves, literally, and the world didn't need them to translate it. The world just felt it. That is the thing about great art. It doesn't require a common language. It requires a common humanity. And BTS, who started in a small practice room in Seoul with no money and no connections and nothing but each other and the music, have always understood something the industry kept trying to tell them was a weakness. Being exactly who you are is not a limitation. It is the only strategy that lasts. When Jin talked about why he performs, it's the roar of the crowd that keeps me going. He wasn't talking about validation. He was talking about connection. The thing that music, at its best and most honest, makes possible across every border we have drawn on this planet. On July 19th, 2026, at halftime of the FIFA World Cup Final, that connection happened at a scale no K-pop artist, no artist of any genre, had ever achieved before. 7 boys from Seoul, 1 billion people watching, and a folk song that is older than any of them. That is not just a music story. That is history. I want to hear from you right now. Where were you when BTS performed at the World Cup Final? Were you watching? Did you cry? Did someone who had never heard of BTS turn to you and ask who they were? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this video hit you the way I hope it did, if it made you feel even a fraction of what that moment felt like, please hit the like button. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to see this story. Subscribe if you're new here. We are Zenk Pop, and we cover BTS, K-pop, and the moments that actually matter, not just the headlines. I'll see you in the next one.